Good morning. I'm going to start by fulfilling a basic principle of the natural law as regards hydration. All right, well, the natural law jokes don't go very far. And that might indeed be, in some sense, a way to start. Natural law, we might say, has come upon us on hard times these days. Why is that so? Let's consider a few of the things that at least traditionally have been held forth as being dealt with by the natural law, but seem still highly contested. As I was preparing this work, of course, recent explosions politically in the United States regarding abortion certainly come to mind. Historically, it would be said that it is simply obvious that direct killing of the innocent is not permissible in any moral structure. And yet we see not only people who aren't sure whether there mightn't be exceptions, but people who are loudly asserting that the destruction of life in the womb just is important for justice, and that unless it be permitted, one will not have a just society. We have in both Europe and in North America, and to some extent in Latin America as well, seen also questions about the nature of marriage lately. It was taken as obvious to anyone with reason that the purpose of marriage was the kind of union that could be reproductive and to rear children. And yet now it is taken by many to be perfectly obvious that this is not the case. And there doesn't seem to be any easy way to have these groups be in dialogue. Finally, just so it might not seem that I am only on one side of a political fence, the notion of a just wage and that the economy exists precisely for the flourishing of persons and families, and therefore any economic order that leads to a growing poverty among persons and families is not simply bad economics, but contrary to nature, is also something that certainly in our day of global capitalism is highly contested, and people simply aren't sure that that ought to be the case. So much as they might want people to be able to flourish, they don't think that's necessarily what defines a good economy. So if questions like the notion of the act of abortion, rather, or so-called same-sex marriage, or the just wage, are themselves supposed to be, on the one hand, things knowable by natural reason and parts of the natural law, and it is the case that at least presumptively intelligent people don't see that these claims are true. That is, one is not saying here that there are simply stupid people who don't see it, but intelligent, functioning members of society hold radically different views. And while we seem incapable of finding a way to come to anything close to an agreement, one wonders if the notions of natural law might not, in fact, be confused. Some scholars have raised the question, for instance, as to whether or not the natural law is simply theology in disguise. Is it, in fact, a way to pretend that one is talking about reason, while in fact trying to import in civil and secular society precepts that are only knowable by virtue of revelation? We'll probably hear some more about that later. Or some people who might regard the natural law as real and knowable by reason might nonetheless assert that we can only be certain about its contents, its more particular contents at least, in light of Christian revelation for various reasons, some of which I will be touching on. On the other hand, if it is something that is supposed to be arrived at by natural reason, if the principles of natural law, at least the most common ones, are supposed to be known to all, then why has it not succeeded in showing its truth? Why have we had such a hard time in convincing people about the principles of natural law? While it looks at first glance that this shouldn't be hard, at least for serious people who work on the issue all the time, ethicists or politicians. To begin to answer this question, I think I want to say, and here I'm parallel with, but we're not going to have time to get in detail with, if people have questions about it later, I'm happy to address the thought of Alistair MacIntyre, his more recent thought about how natural law and the natural law tradition relates to how to deal with seemingly incommensurable moral theories, and the role of dialogue, which he thinks that mutual ethical discernment helps to show the truth of natural law, but in a sort of indirect way. I'll leave that as a side for a moment. But in a similar vein, what I want to do here is suggest that natural law, at least as understood by St. Thomas, already anticipates the kinds of problems that we are going to find in society, the problems of pinning down and getting people to see the precepts that on the one hand are knowable by reason, but on the other hand might, with human beings as they are, not be able to be known as such easily or readily. So what do we mean then for St. Thomas by natural law? And here I want to rehearse for you some of what is the principle of natural law. For those of you who know these principles, you can catch up on your social media. No, don't do that. And the rest of you, I hope this helps us frame what we're talking about for this whole weekend, at least as regards natural, not biblical law. What does Thomas think we mean by natural law? We first have to know what Thomas thinks we mean by law, right? So we know what we're talking about here. Thomas tells us in his definition, he has two definitions, one fuller, one shorter. He says that law is nothing other than a certain ordination of reason for the common good, promulgated by him who has care of the community. That's the fuller definition, which I'll unpack in a moment. Or a shorter definition, it's a certain dictate of practical reason in the prince who governs some complete community. Right, so law is nothing other than a certain ordination of reason. Law, Thomas tells us, is a rule and a measure, and it's a measure of acts. And if those acts are human acts, then the rule and measure of human acts is precisely reason, to which, says St. Thomas, it belongs to order things to an end. And therefore, law is an ordination of reason, principally about inducing people to acts or drawing them back from acting. And that's the second definition, helps us by pointing out of practical reason. So it's about doing or not doing things. Since the ultimate end, if law is about a rule and measure of acts, and acts are about ordering to an end, since the ultimate end of human life is happiness, felicitas or beatitudo in his account of the law, and since human beings are parts of a larger community, and since every part is ordered to the whole, then it follows that law is principally concerned not with ordering individuals, but ordering individuals in light of a common happiness, which he will then later clarify as the common good. Hence, a certain ordination of reason ad bonum commune, for the common good. Now, since it touches the whole, Thomas thinks that it belongs in principle to the whole multitude of persons. It's sort of a radically democratic moment, but we won't get into Aquinas' politics for now. Or he says, at least it falls upon those who are charged with care of the whole to establish law. And that's where he says, by him who has care of the community. And finally, law, to be law, has to be applied to those who are ruled and measured by it. But to apply something to someone who is rational means to promulgate it, that is, to make it known to them, and thus promulgate it. So that's why we have our definition. All right, if that's what it is for anything to be law, according to Thomas, what is it for something to be natural law? It might be helpful at first to remind ourselves what natural law is not on this view. It's not, for those of us living after the 17th century, it's hard to remind ourselves, it's not the laws of nature that one would read about in the scientific revolution from the 17th century forward. It's not, in other words, a description of the regular repeated behavior of natural objects, of which one natural object is a human being. So that's not what's intended here by natural law. Rather, for Thomas, natural law is, he says, nothing other than, it's his favorite phrase in his treatise on law, nihil aliud est quam. It's nothing other than the participation in the eternal law in a rational creature. So what's eternal law? Briefly, eternal law is, if you will, the very intelligibility of God's pattern of governance of things, which Thomas clarifies to be nothing other than the divine nature itself. The universe is governed and patterned off of God's own nature. Now, Thomas tells us that all created things participate in the eternal law, which is his way of saying that all things in their very and particular mode of being, in their mode of acting, in their way of coming to their ends and their proper flourishing, are all said to have a share in the ratio or logos that is God himself. Or, as Thomas will say, all things take part in some respect, ad equaliter, in the eternal law, inasmuch, namely, as they have, from an impression of it on them, inclinations towards their proper acts and ends. Now, just to be clear, a Thomistic inclination need not be a conscious or felt desire. In fact, that's really not what he has in mind at all. He's not talking about someone who says, but I feel like eating donuts every morning. That's not an inclinatio that Thomas is talking about. That's something more like a desire and probably a wicked one. A stone, as far as Thomas is concerned, can have an inclination, if you're in Aristotelian physics, to go down. That's what stones are inclined to do, to go to the center of the world. And an eye has an inclination to see. Right? So what you're talking about here by inclinations is the directedness of things to come to their full flourishing as what they are. So every kind of thing participates then in the eternal law according to the kind of thing that it is, or said differently, participation in the eternal law directs us to what the thing is and in what it finds its end, and how it comes to that end being the kind of thing that it is. So the law that we're talking about is rooted in the nature of things and entails their teleology. Human beings, then, have a particular mode of participating in the eternal law, as every creature does. And the human way of doing that is as rational animals, which is what they are, their nature. And it is this participation of rational animals in the larger divine governance of the world that we call natural law. That's why we had to rehearse all of this to see the larger pattern. We can't understand what Thomas wants us to hear about the natural law without thinking about the particular mode in which something exists, its nature, and the end to which that nature is directed, and the means that that nature has, according to its own nature, to arrive at that end. Because we are rational animals, the natural law will be a knowing way, a rational way, so a knowing way of coming to one's end, one that makes use of human reason, and in particular, practical reason, namely reason by which we know about what we need to do. And so we can grasp ends and grasp them as good, and we can grasp what we need to do to arrive at that end, that is to say, determining means. But while it's about knowing, it's not exhausted by knowing, because the natural law attends to the whole nature of the human being. So while the human way of coming to the human end in God is a knowing way, it has to take into account that human beings are living sensitive substances. Now, just as speculative reason begins from first principles from which subsequent principles are derived and conclusions may then be drawn, so too with practical reason. That is, the operative idea in natural law is that the natural light of reason is able, when attending to experience, more on that in just a moment, when attending to experience, it can grasp the first and most fundamental principle of natural law, which in this case is that the good is what is to be pursued. Now, I want to add here on the side, it will be more relevant later, that experience in Thomas doesn't mean a single event, Like I had a great experience last night, and you said that that's not what is intended here. Experience is meant by the repeated sensory encounter with the world in a certain way, which then, prepared by the internal senses, reaches a point internally that it can be made intelligible to the person just then by considering it directly. So experience for Aristotle and Thomas is in agreement here, is not a momentary thing. It is something that takes a certain amount of time, and it requires various powers, particularly sensitive powers, in order to be fully operative. To grasp the meaning of the world means to have at least first encountered it in a sensory way, for human beings, certainly. Now, from this first principle of natural law, that the good is what is to be pursued, we can see immediately the first precept of natural law. That's precepts because they're telling us what to do. The good is to be pursued and the evil shunned. Now, this principle and this precept might seem vacuous at first. And because it's, well, sure, why not? And that is part of Thomas's point, right? It's obvious. It's not vacuous, he thinks, but it is obvious. And this is his idea, that all people just see that to be so, because all people, when they're pursuing what they're pursuing, do it under some description to them as good. And when they try to avoid something, it's because that thing they're avoiding, under some description to them, is evil or bad. But one of the ways to get any more content in this is, of course, considering this first principle in light of human nature as a living substance, as an animal, and as rational. And from those three considerations, we can know at least the most basic precepts of the natural law founded on the first precept. As substances, we have an inclination to continue in existence, and thus those precepts that touch fundamentally on self-preservation, preserving and maintaining our life, fall in that sense of considering our nature. As animals, Thomas focuses on the fact of, put typically Thomistically chastely, the joining of male and female, and the concomitant raising of children. And then he just says, and other such things, right? So heavily part of his idea is that grasping that we're animal leads us relatively quickly, we'll talk about this again in a moment, to see that their part of the natural law has to do with the coming together of men and women to have children and then raise them. As rational, he thinks that our natural inclinations direct us to having precepts about knowing the truth about God and about what pertains to living in society. And so it would entail at this most basic and common level an obligation to avoid ignorance, and this is a lovely idea, not to trouble those with whom we live. And those of us who live in community might appreciate that this is a precept of the natural law. So whether we always attend to it is another question. Now, to be sure, all of this seems quite remote from any concrete activity. And of course, all activity is in the end lived in the concrete, and it is indeed remote from any concrete activity, and that for two main reasons. The first has to do with how it is that we come to the knowledge of the precepts of the natural law. And the second touches upon what I want to call the unavoidable incompleteness of the natural law in a total account of human acting. So let's consider the first of these, namely how it is that we arrive at our knowledge of the precepts of natural law. As we noted above, the first principle of practical reason is drawn from our experience of the world and seems to be with us already by the moment we're conscious of anything going on in any certainly rational way. It is not, in other words, for Thomas, something innate, some principle that just happens to be in us and structures the way we see the world, but might or might not be true, nor is it merely something that's asserted, that is simply a given that says, let's take it to be the case that good is what is pursued, but rather it is just seen to be true immediately when considering our experience. Remember again what he means by experience as a cumulative thing. So even as this is on Thomas's view, this is parallel to the way that we grasp the first principle of speculative reason, namely that nothing can both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. That too, he says, comes from a consideration of experience, but comes to us immediately, not argued for, but just seen to be true. From this first principle, Thomas asserts that we can, as he says, immediately, but with a little consideration, statim cum modica consideratione. With that, we can grasp what he calls the common and first principles of natural law. Now, Thomas takes these other principles to be known equally to all. So much so, he thinks, that these principles, these precepts, cannot be erased from the human heart as such. Although it should be noted here that as regards the application even of these common and universally known principles to some particular act in the concrete, Thomas thinks that reason can be impeded, he says, due to concupiscence or other passions. But the idea that Thomas seems to have here is that you wouldn't fail to know what you're obliged to do. That is, it's not as though you simply don't realize what these first principles are in any sense. And it seems to be that if you were not grasped in that passion and you were attentive to things, you would just see the truth of these first principles, as he says, with only a little bit of thinking about it. But rather, his idea seems to be that due to your passion, you choose, perhaps not making that choice known to yourself, but you choose to attend to the passion rather than to think about the things you otherwise know. This is, which I will not get into here, but it may be part of a conversation, what Thomas will identify as the grave sin of folly, when things are known to you, but you just choose not to attend to them. Yet while these common, or as also called the most common principles, may be obvious in the sense that they're grasped directly once you attend to them, not all principles and precepts of the natural law are of this sort. Indeed, one suspects, and I think this is right on Thomas's view, that much that has been asserted to be grounded in natural law is not of the common sort, but the sort that he will call the secondary precepts. The secondary precepts, according to Thomas, are, as he will call them, quasi-conclusiones. They're something like conclusions in speculative reasoning, and thus they flow from, but are not immediately obvious in the first principles themselves. These secondary principles then are not immediately known, nor even with just a little thought, like the first and common ones are, but only, he says, through the diligent investigation of the wise. We may figure out if we are they. And like the conclusions of other sciences, these conclusions are delivered to those who are not among the wise, or at least who are less wise, through teaching. And even this does not render what has been taught thus to be easily known and grasped by those who are not counted among the wise. It's important to remember that feature about teaching. One can communicate something, but if the person receiving it has a less sharp capacity for understanding, they won't grasp it as well as the person who taught it. And so they may know its content, but might not themselves see as easily how it derives from the other principles that they do know more clearly. In fact, says Thomas, even for the wise, there's a difficulty that is caused, which is caused in knowing the precepts in all of their details, because we can't easily anticipate the innumerable actual or potential circumstances that will attend concrete particular acts. One example he gives, we can have a principle that you ought to return what has been loaned to you. That's something which you can get to as a precept of the natural law. But that what happens in the case that someone wants to get their gun back and you know that they want to start an armed revolution against the state, right? And so you have to, that wouldn't have first been thought through. You might, I didn't even think of that case when I was thinking of the obligation to return what has been loaned. And therefore, there must be some more concrete version of that precept that handles in more detail with a death by 1,000 qualifications, what then is still binding on all persons, or maybe not binding on all persons. So this is a difficulty that attends on Thomas's view even to the wise, that particular acts, we can consider them subtly, but they're so varied and the circumstances so competing that the evaluations may turn out to be themselves competing and incompatible, not because one of the two isn't true, but it's not immediately obvious even to the wise how to resolve the disagreement. And so this is to be, I think, distinguished from a case where it becomes easily or more readily obvious to the wise that they're differing, say, about means to an end, which should be more relatively easy to resolve. But when they're just not sure what the precepts are, it's more difficult. So taking do the good and avoid the evil as the first precept of natural law, Thomas holds that, would hold that such precepts as honor your father and mother, or thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not steal, as the kinds of precepts that are readily seen to be true, although a little bit just below about the problem with even these in the case of stealing. While a precept like one that I love, rise up before the hoary head, which you clearly do not follow that precept because you're all seated. Rise up before the hoary head and honor the person of the aged man, is, he says, the sort of precept, that's from Leviticus, the sort of precept that would only be judged by the wise, although it could be taught by those who are less wise. These secondary precepts, unlike the more common ones, are then subject to a more precarious fortune. In part, this is because they must be considered carefully by the wise, and even the wise, as Thomas will note here and elsewhere, can make mistakes in their reasoning. They must also be communicated by way of teaching to those who are less wise, which itself raises the complications that come from the act of teaching and the act of learning, and thus the skill of the teacher in presenting the material, the aptness of those being taught to learn, the existence or lack thereof of institutions through which this teaching can be preserved and passed on and reconsidered or even improved, and of the cultural practices and products, we might think of things, poetry, art, and such, that embody these insights so that they can be grasped experientially by the community as a whole, even those who are less wise. Now, this latter point touches on an important theme raised by Jacques Maritain in his consideration of the natural law in his work, Man and the State. There, Maritain states that much of this quasi-concluding character of practical reason of the natural law, he says, when we are thinking about that, we need to attend to the fact that it's not like syllogistic reasoning. That's not the way we come to know the principles of natural law, but it merely comes through the inclinations of human nature. Now, even if with Gregory Dulin, we take Maritain's account of inclinations to be somewhat faulty, I think I can agree with Maritain regarding the cultural and contextual and indeed historical character of the realization and transmission of the secondary principles and precepts of natural law. Maritain might even suggest that some of this historical character might touch on those traditions that are, or rather those principles that are more common. The secondary precepts of the natural law, in other words, are not to be taken as a fixed set of laws already known in all detail and not subject to further revision and precision, as we might well take the insights of the past few centuries touching on human dignity to be evidence of that, right? Human dignity, rightly understood, human autonomy seem to be real advances in our understanding of the natural law in a way they wouldn't have been understood in those terms in the 13th century. Moreover, there are crucial moral conditions that impede the ability to grasp the precepts of this secondary sort. So there's the intellectual problems that are built in, even if everyone's doing their job properly, that make it hard to get to these. But there's also moral problems that will impede our grasping of these secondary precepts, which indeed, says Thomas, can be blotted out from the hearts of men. An evil character, he says, which can also derail speculative reasoning, can produce errors in moral reasoning. as can wicked customs and corrupt habits. And with regard to the latter, the customs and the habits, while it's certainly the case that Thomas could have in mind individual faults, his primary example of this case appeals to a claim made by Julius Caesar that among the Germans, theft was not seen to be evil. Whatever the truth of Caesar's account, and Caesar is notoriously bad in his ethnography, Thomas, in approving the story, is therefore clearly talking about collective kinds of wicked habits and customs, things that are imbued in the cultural practices of a society, with the result that people in that society are just blind to things that in principle they could know by reason, but in fact won't see until those customs are altered. And this example is complicated by the fact, I think, that Thomas also considers the moral prohibition against theft to be one of those principles that are immediately known, right? He's just been saying this is an example of how secondary precepts can go wrong. And then he appeals to a precept that later, when he's dealing with the Decalogue, he says, in fact, is one of those earlier precepts. I want to jump forward just a little for the sake of time. So we've got this sort of moral problems in acquiring the natural law. I want to touch briefly then on what I want to call the incompleteness of the natural law. One of the reasons I think deriving the principles of natural law is difficult for us is that the natural law is never, on Thomas's theory, intended to be the complete account of human action, even as regards law. Certainly, from a theological point of view, which I will leave more to the theologians, there is the divine law, which is decreed for those things that we couldn't know by reason alone. So I'll set that aside for a later talk. But it's also true that human law, although derived from natural law, is necessary for concretizing what the law is, right? Just as the way we might say the fact that we have eyes and hands lets us make things like clothes and houses, but we have to figure out how to do those and what ways work and what ways are conducive to human flourishing in houses and with clothing. And that comes out of the same thing that human law does. Human law is also, and this is important, necessary for cultivating the virtue of the people who will then be able to see the precepts of the natural law more readily. So the natural law, known in itself, has a hard time of getting you to see and follow it. Human law, which applies it to you in concrete ways, enables you to, if you're bad, be restrained and learn how to be good, and if you're good, to learn how to be better. Finally, and this is what I want to touch on as a kind of caution, and perhaps to anticipate a little what we might hear later in this weekend. Thomas, when he's commenting on Romans 2:14-15, for those of you who don't remember, for when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature those things that are of the law, these having not the law are a law to themselves, who show the work of their law in their hearts. We might be tempted to think that what this is trying to say is merely by knowledge of the natural law, by natural powers alone, the Gentiles did what they're supposed to do. That is not, in fact, Thomas's reading of this passage. Thomas says here that, in fact, what's at stake here is not the Gentiles apart from revelation in Christ, but quite rather, he means those Gentiles who have been converted to the faith with the help of the grace of Christ, and thus can keep the moral law. And he says, or it might mean that they see through the natural law what is to be done, but that he sees merely as doing what the Torah does, the law, which is give them knowledge of sin, which nonetheless needs grace to move them to act. So I raised this last point with one final point, and then I'll conclude. In the consideration of the moral features of the old law, Thomas is less sanguine about how easily people can know the moral law. He says, why did these precepts of the natural law need to be in the old law at all? And he says, because most people don't follow them, or at least many don't. He said, many people regard things that are evil in themselves to be licit. right? So that while we might see, if we just look at the treatise and the law, that Thomas is a theory that if we're just trying hard enough, we'll get to the precepts of natural law. Thomas actually holds that that's not generally the case for the human situation. So I'll close then with noting that I think this is, if you will, a warning here, because the very Thomistic doctrine of natural law explains how, without real effort, without a meaningful way to teach and communicate the fruits of that effort, without laws or at least institutions and cultural practices that live out the precepts and cultivate the virtues that enable the ready grasp of those principles, then the assurance of this hard-won tradition of natural law and its insight might not be so secure. But I also think this is an encouragement, because this sort of effort to produce such practices, to produce such laws, because they arise out of the very inclinations of human nature, will in the end attract even those who are not yet ready to assert their truth.
Thank you very much, Father. Are there any questions? Sister Helen first. The microphone is coming.
Look out.
Thank you very much. Interesting talk. I'd just like to ask a question about the last point about the role of grace in the difficulty of understanding, knowing, understanding at all. I'm wondering if Thomas was here today, thinking about the fact that we live mostly in a post-Christian society, Western world, but still, even if people are not baptized, they're not officially part of the church, they can be inspired by deep gospel values, people who are in favor of human rights, people who are, I'm wondering whether you could say anything about how the role of grace could be present in some way in our society, even if it's not transmitted through the secure and sure means that we know through the sacraments.
Right. So I do think that there will be a resonance with the both declaration of and living out of the natural law, because it in fact follows the inclinations of human nature, even by those who might reject that account of why they're resonating with it. So I think that's certainly true. I will, however, agree with, maybe not however, in addition, agree with Alistair McIntyre here on his account of resolving seemingly intractable problems, that he gives a sort of historical account of what happened to natural law. Briefly, the idea is that teleology got lost, and as a result, you're left with, if you will, the monuments of natural law, the precepts that it found, and on the other hand, you're left with the notion about the desire to be fulfilled. And the problem is, since people thought that final causes were bad, then they were forced to choose. Either you have to create a moral account that is based simply on law that's just there. So you get a Lockean natural law that just says natural law is what it is because it's decreed by God. Or you eventually get Bentham and Mill, and you have some sort of, or Machiavelli in his own way, some sort of account in which fulfilling of a kind of desire has to be right. Now, the irony is that natural law tradition says, in fact, the laws are fulfilling of you. That's why they're both binding on you and like as law, but that it's not contrary to your good because it's fulfilling of your nature. So that I think with McIntyre, I think we need to be careful because people might recognize the principles or the idea of fulfillment, but if they have a bad idea about what the end is, or whether or not end is a category we should talk about with morality, there will always be these seemingly intractable conflicts. So I think that's the cautionary advice, although my sanguine moments, I do think that because of human inclinations, there will always be a positive resonance with anything that does flow from the natural law.
They're in the back.
Good You talked about reasons why people might not grasp the precepts of the natural law, like passion and social habit. I think it's Benoit who talks about the fact that people might not grasp low-level precepts of the natural law because there's a good attached to going against the precept. So if I want to choose to give people low wages because there's the good that certain things might come better in my business, or I choose an abortion, and I might have the good of being able to complete my education or something like that. So do you think that's also part, an explanation of why people don't grasp the natural law, and maybe even they grasp the primary or more primary precepts, which I don't think do or applies it to?
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about there in terms of the goods that they see attached to the other activity, I would fold that into what Thomas is saying in terms of the passions, that there is a kind of delight they see that comes from there. I would agree as well that this is more of a case or can be, more of a case of a lack of attention or folly or inconsideratio in Thomas's language. Why? Because if someone might say, well, abortion might be seen as legitimate, if you were to say something like, you can have a very successful business if we're allowed to torture your daughter, once a week, they would immediately see that there's no commensurability with that offer, and they would immediately refuse it. So part of the problem is a material problem, I think, in that case as well. That is, getting the wise to help people see why this is a parallel case. Dismembering your daughter or dismembering the child in the womb are exactly parallel, but that is not perhaps so readily seen. And I think you're right, because there are other goods that are more immediate to us. But on reflection, in a parallel case, we might be able to operate according to the proper precepts, right? So then the question is going to be, is it because we just don't see? Is it a merely cognitive or a noetic problem? Or is it because at some level we don't want to see for the sake of the good that we want to have?
There's a question here.
You mentioned that the natural law by itself is not enough. The man needs natural law, other law, human law. Sort of my sister said, St. Thomas addressed the question of whether something can be saved purely by the natural law without grace, without positive human law. It lives or is like according to the natural law towards the good, or it is goodwill or is it like according to the natural law, God sees that goodwill and it's going to give grace, or is it possible for someone slowly to order his life according to the natural law and acquire salvation without these other supplemental things?
Right. So Thomas, I can't even just say he's not sanguine. He's clear that no one is saved apart from the grace of Christ. So that there's no such thing as an alternate method to come to salvation. Thomas also thinks that we won't be able to consistently maintain even the fullness of the natural law. The built into Thomas's account is not just a theoretical structure of natural law, but a history of the human race. And therefore, no human being finds himself or herself outside of the fall of Adam and Eve, nor outside of the proclamation of the gospel, right? In his view, this is part of the human, and I sound like a 20th century philosopher, the human condition, or what it is to be human, is that historical part is relevant. So the reason the natural law isn't enough is in part because of the end to which we're being directed, and that when we're going to talk about the old and new law will be relevant there because it's a supernatural end. But also it's not enough because there just is not, the human condition as wounded by sin means that all of these complications are going to come in, right? They're just going to interrupt any attempt to do so. So what one would have to say is that any non-believer in the revealed faith who is very good, like Job on Thomas's view, is being prepared by God to receive the goods that he wants to give him. So when Job is good and upright, fears the Lord and avoids evil, right? The idea is that here's a pagan Gentile, but who has these goods. But the reason he ultimately has these goods is because God is preparing him. Job is mentioned in that same passage, Thomas's commentary on Romans. So it's nestled in this idea that the Gentiles he has in mind are not the ones outside of the drama of election and grace. So that there's not, say, the story about election and then a parallel story about just trying hard. On Thomas's view, if your trying hard leads you to come to see the truth of the gospel, your trying hard was already part of the story of election, which is already part of the story of Christ. If I were in class, I would step off the podium because I'd be talking about theology as a philosopher. So.
We have now one last question. I mean, I don't have any.
Well, they need it online. They need it online. They're yeah.
Yes, thank you. So my question is basic one, just to make sure I comprehended the scheme. First principles of natural law are simply goods that we apprehend in our first experience of the world. And then the second secondary.
You have the secondary precepts, right? So you have these first principles. Good is to be pursued, but because good is what all things pursue, and we recognize it as our good, it then comes to us as a precept. Do the good, right? So once you see the principles, they then are. There's no fact and value dichotomy here, because if you see it as good, that is what goods are. They are ends, and if you see it as a human good, then you in fact receive it as a precept. So you first have the very first one, do the good, avoid the evil, from which he thinks just the basic consideration of human nature as a substance, as an animal, and as rational gives you these most common principles that are going to be quickly seen by all. And then you have what he calls quasi-conclusions that you derive from them. They are rooted in them, but they're the kinds of conclusions that aren't readily seen by all or even by many.
Okay, so we start by apprehending goods, and then we arrive at first precepts, or the first precept, which is simply good to be pursued, enables to be avoided. And then we eventually arrive to reflection at secondary.
Well, the intermediate is because we recognize our nature, we have these common principles, but they're the proper common principles that he says we arrive at immediately with just a little bit of consideration, because all it requires is that we be aware of what kinds of things we are and the inclinations that derive from them. We don't need to know about the nitty-gritty of life. Whereas the secondary conclusions are the ones that are going to start touching on then something like just wage doesn't come from immediate consideration of human nature, even if it is part of the natural law.
Okay, thank you. No, I just wanted to make sure that comes to count.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure.
Thank you very much. Let's join me and thank Father Dominic. Half of an hour break. There are refreshments and drinks outside. Please come back at 11:15 for the second lecture. Thank you very much.